Thank you very much, Edward, and thank you for hosting me, and I'm very pleased to be able to be here. I express my thanks to the Middle Eastern Forum too. This is a challenging subject, loyalty and Islam. The problem of citizenship in Western nations for Muslims is a deep and persistent one. It's a sensitive subject, obviously. At various times it's been a xenophobic claim made against particular minorities that they are disloyal to the nation, and it incites prejudice and causes an environment of disadvantage for those minorities. So it's a sensitive subject, but still, in the case of Islam, a very important one. There have been any number of incidents in democratic states which show that, at least for some Muslims, the issue of loyalty is a serious one. There was the stabbing and attempted murder of a former British government minister, Stephen Timms, by Roshanara Chowdhury. A young woman, she refused to attend court sessions during the case against her because she said she did not recognise the authority of the British court. Another case here in the US, Major Naid al-Hassan, he had advised his superiors, giving the arguments clearly, that he would have a problem being posted to Iraq or Afghanistan, and when he was posted, he did exactly what he had explained would happen in that situation. He launched an attack on his fellow soldiers in the US Army. And there have been many reports in the media that we see of conflict between Muslim minorities and their surrounding societies in Western nations. It's not difficult to find cases where issues of loyalty, identity, exclusion, inclusion have been very much on the agenda. It's interesting to note that this is not a new problem. The issue of identity and inclusion of Muslims under non-Muslim governance was an important issue centuries ago. It was a key issue for the British Empire, for example. Queen Victoria found that she was ruling around a third of the Muslims in the world. And it became an issue for the British government how to manage that and whether the Muslims under the Queen of England could be loyal citizens of the British Empire. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, an important aspect of this question of identity and loyalty was resolved quite early. A key passage is in the book of Jeremiah, where there's a letter that's written to the Jews in exile which encourages them to settle down, have children, do well, prosper, seek the well-being of the city in which you live. From Jeremiah chapter 29. Seek the prosperity and peace of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. So be a blessing to the state. And the story of the book of Daniel encourages the Jews and explores the questions of how to be loyal to a non-believing ruler when you're in a situation of being a religious minority. And the Christian writers in the New Testament continue that theme. So you have both Peter and Paul arguing that Christians should be subject to the pagan authorities. In contrast, Islam has always had great difficulty separating political from religious identity. And in classical Arabic, there's not even the language to render this distinction, the distinction between the secular and the ecclesiastical, which is absolutely fundamental in Christian thought from the very beginning. It goes back to the Greek categories of ecclesia, the church, taken over from the Hebrew kahal, and also the world, aeon, the Latin secular. So the distinction goes right back to the roots of the faith between ecclesiastical and secular, the world and the church. The Islam take on politics and religion goes back to Muhammad. He combined in himself the offices of Chief Justice of the state, head of the army, king and high priest. So he combined all power in himself. And one of the key principles of Islamic faith is that Muhammad's example is the best example. So what he did, others should follow. And this establishes the principle that there's no distinction between religion and politics in a very deep and profound way in the Islamic consciousness. There's also an issue in classical Islamic jurisprudence around the situation of a Muslim living under non-Muslim rule. The classical view of Islamic law is that the world is divided into the House of Islam, the Dar al-Islam, and the Dar al-Harb, the House of War. And a Muslim is not allowed to live in the lands of the infidel in classical Islam. They had to come and live in the house of Islam. It's a religious duty for them to do so. And so there's a consensus in Islamic law that if a Muslim happens to find themselves outside the domain of Islamic law and Islamic polity, they should migrate and live under Islamic rule. Muhammad said after he established political Islam in Medina that every Muslim should go to live where Islam is dominant. He said, "I am not responsible for any Muslim who lives amongst the polytheists." And they said, "Why, Apostle of Allah?" And he said, "Who joins the polytheists and lives with them, he is like them." He said, "Migration will not end until repentance ends, and repentance will not end until the sun rises in the west." So until the end of time, Muslims have a duty to migrate to where Islam is dominant. Surah 4 of the Quran says that the angels will interrogate Muslims who lived among the disbelievers and ask them why they didn't migrate. And it is said that a great reward will await every Muslim who migrates to a Muslim land. His recompense is reserved with Allah, a great blessing. Now this perspective, which as I said is the classical jurisprudence, the classical view, well supported, it was reflected in a statement by Craig Baxham, who was a former US Army cryptologist recently arrested on giving support to a terrorist organisation. He said he believed he had a duty to migrate to Muslim territory. Unfortunately for him, there were only two places that he thought fitted that. One was Somalia and the other was Afghanistan. So he was sort of on his way to Somalia. But there are also quite a lot of traditions, important traditions of Muhammad, that it's wrong for Muslims to copy or emulate the ways of non-Muslims. Now, all this created an issue for the British, as I explained. When they conquered a large part of the Muslim world, infidel sovereignty over Muslims could be a trigger for them to fight, to wage jihad against the British. And for that reason, the British were theologically quite creative, and they managed to get from the Ottoman Caliphate and also from the Meccan heads of the Hanafi and Shafi'i schools of law. These are the two main schools of law, Sunni law, that applied in India. They got rulings or fatwas declaring that the British Empire was Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam. So these were obtained in 1857 and renewed in 1864, and the Meccan fatwas were renewed in 1914. This was a message to all Muslims living in British India that because the Muslims were living in an Islamic state, they had no duty to rebel or to migrate or otherwise cause problems for the Queen. So it's not a new problem. And many religious leaders in India agreed with the fatwas and supported them. And they urged Indian Muslims to settle down and contribute to building British India and to support it. And they used their support later as a bargaining chip when a colonial period ended to install aspects of Sharia law into Indian law. But not all agreed with this strategy. Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani, he was an ideological precursor to the modern-day radical movements. He took the view that it was better to bide your time and prepare for another day when there'd be an opportunity to fight against the British or whoever. Now, this issue of identity and loyalty is coming back to us today, and not in the context of conquest of Muslim countries, but due to the huge flows of immigration of Muslims into the West, into nations like the USA, Britain, Norway, France, even Australia. And how then should Muslims understand their presence living in the land of the infidels? It's a significant theological, social identity question. In the early 1980s, Taha Jabil al-Alwani, who helped to found the International Institute of Islamic Thought in Washington and founded the Fiqh Council of North America, wrote a letter with 28 questions to the International Fiqh Academy, which had been newly formed by the Organisation for the Islamic Conference. This academy, the Fiqh Academy, is set up as a supreme body of jurisprudence in the world by the OIC, which is sort of like a United Nations of Islam. It began operations in 1985 and it's held 19 sessions since 1985. It's constituted by about 40 scholars at present, and they're all Grand Muftis or recognised absolute supreme authorities of Islamic law in their own nations. So it would be like convening a gathering of the Supreme Court judges of English-speaking nations and getting them together to talk about issues of law for the world, for the whole world. So it's an ambitious project, the work of the International Fiqh Academy. And they are certainly, can be described as mainstream Islam. It'd be very bizarre to say that they weren't. Now, these legal minds normally gather in Saudi Arabia, and all their deliberations and most of their publications are in Arabic, and they mainly concern themselves with modern issues such as Sharia finance and medical science implications for living as a Muslim in the modern world, but they've also looked at other issues such as human rights. I've written some articles on 3 fatwas they did on human rights a few years back. Now, Al-Alwani's 28 questions came at the very beginning of the activities of the Academy, and they were all about living as a Muslim in the West, and specifically referring to the USA and Europe, and some of the questions were very specific. For example, is it permissible, if the workplace requires it, for a Muslim woman to shake the hand of a non-Muslim man? The answer is no, it's not. Can a Muslim woman pluck her eyebrows? No, she can't. If a Muslim woman marries a non-Muslim hoping to convert him to Islam, is that legitimate? No, it's not. Can a Muslim eat meat slaughtered by Christians or Jews? Yes, that's permitted, said the International Fiqh Academy. So, other interesting questions. The first question, which interestingly the Academy never answered publicly, was this. It's quite a long question, but the question is basically, is a Muslim allowed to be a citizen in a Muslim country, in a non-Muslim country? What is the ruling in regards to the matter of naturalisation in a foreign nationality, whether American nationality or any of the other European nationalities? And then it says, take into account that many of those that are seeking to be naturalised have fled countries in which they've been more persecuted for their faith than they would be in the US. So they've fled Egypt because they were perhaps a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, and it's not safe there. They come to America. They have much more freedom to live as a Muslim there. Is it permissible for them to become an American citizen when their rights, their religious rights, are more protected in the new country? It's an interesting question. Why is that even a question? That is it permissible to be a citizen? And why was it that the Fiqh Academy never answered it? They answered all the other questions. Why didn't they come out and say, yes or no, you can't be a citizen? The tradition, of course, would be the answer is no. Muslims are not allowed to live outside the Dar al-Islam. Now, part of the issue is the concept of the ummah, or the Muslim nationality, Muslim nation. The understanding is that religion and politics are intertwined, so your religious identity is a political identity. And there's a sense of conflicted allegiance. If you live outside an Islamic state, you have your feet in both camps. You're a member of the Muslim nationality, but also of this other nationality. And it's very interesting the language that scholars use about this situation. Some of them speak about melting or being diluted in the lands of the infidel. It's a bit like the idea if you take the ember, the coal out of the Islamic fire, and put it to one side, it will go cold and die. And there are quite a number of hadiths that warn against the danger of losing your identity. One of the traditions or hadiths of Muhammad says that it was wrong to look like non-Muslims. You shouldn't dress like them. For those who look alike are of the same, he said. So if you look like them, you are of them. And traditions are used by scholars to say that they were used, for example, to insist that non-Muslims should dress differently under Islamic law, to keep them distinct, even in an Islamic country. So the coloured patch of cloth worn by Jews was an idea developed in medieval Islam, so they could be instantly distinguished. But the reverse also applies. If a Muslim lives in a non-Islamic state, how can they maintain their distinctness and not become like the infidels? There was a concession in traditional Islamic law that a trader or a traveller could stay up to 4 nights in the lands of the infidel, but then they had to come back again. And there was also that principle that I mentioned that once Medina had been established as a political space for Islam, Muslims had a duty to migrate to the Islamic State. Now, there's also a principle repeated many times in the Quran that sovereignty only comes from God, only comes from Allah. So Muslims should only submit to authorities who rule by the laws of Allah. There is no concept of a non-religious authority that's legitimate. So Sharia law has to be applied. And there is a view that in order to follow Sharia law, you need to be in an Islamic state. You need the power of the state to set up an environment in which Muslims are truly free to practice their religion. I'm presenting the traditional classical view to you. So, for example, Sheikh Mohammed al-Mukhtar al-Salami, the Mufti of Tunisia, in his reflections on this issue, he pointed out that in a non-Islamic state, a father has no power to prohibit his son from doing things which are unlawful in Islam. So, because if the state doesn't make those acts illegal, such as drinking alcohol, the father can't compel the son to follow Islam properly. So that's a great disadvantage for a Muslim father, to live in a country where they can't compel their child to follow the law of Islam. The state would normally back them up. In a non-Muslim state, the police will not give a Muslim the power to compel his son to follow Islam. So he said that's a huge disadvantage for Muslims living in a non-Islamic environment. Also, he pointed out that in a non-Islamic society, the nation will not allocate property to your heirs according to Islamic law. And your marriage or divorce should be settled according to Islamic principles. But if the state has other laws, your Islamic way of life won't be supported by the state. If your state is not an Islamic state, you don't enjoy the full rights of living as a Muslim. So there are other verses too that speak about the destiny of Islam to rule and to command what's right and forbid what's wrong, and the great difficulty of fulfilling that mandate in a non-Islamic environment is very clear. There's also a verse that says that believers should not take non-believers for their guardians or protectors. It's wrong for Muslims to be in a position where they're vulnerable and dependent on non-Muslims to protect them and to look after them. Surah 3:28. So there's lots of issues, theological issues in the Quran and in classic jurisprudence that make it hard for Muslims living in a non-Muslim environment. However, there's a principle in Islam. Islam is a very pragmatic faith. So there's a principle that says that necessity permits what's forbidden. So it's forbidden to eat food which is not halal, but if there's no other food, you can eat it. It's compulsory to pray 5 times a day at specified times, but if you can't for some reason, you're travelling, you can catch up later. And so there are concessions available which would allow a Muslim to adopt the sovereignty or the citizenship of a non-Muslim state as a matter of necessity. These are concessions. All the scholars who commented on these fatwas, so the International Fiqh Academy didn't come out with a summary opinion, but they did for a period publish a whole series of rulings by leading scholars, and I managed to download them. Again, they were in Arabic from their website, and they disappeared soon after. But all of the scholars agreed that there were certain circumstances under which it was permissible for a Muslim to be a citizen. For example, Muhammad Taqi Usmani, who for 20 years was Chief Justice on the Pakistan Supreme Court, is now the Vice President of the Islamic Fiqh Academy, one of the leading international experts on Sharia finance. He gave a very detailed answer, and he said, yes, if you're being persecuted for your religious practice in a Muslim country, you're allowed to flee to France or America or somewhere else where you're permitted to practice your religion without persecution. Another concession that the scholars make is that if you're there to practice da'wah, that is to proselytise and promote Islam, that also lets you off the hook of living in a non-Islamic state. Extremely interesting and diverse rulings from different scholars that the Fiqh Academy put out. It's important to emphasise, I said it before, but I'll say it again, the scholars that I'm speaking about are the supreme authorities. They're very well-regarded, well-respected people. These are the muftis, the most senior authorities in their nations, selected and gathered together for that reason. A very common theme of these rulings is the importance of protecting the Islamic identity. They're very concerned about protecting against the dangers of assimilation and integration. They all reject that possibility. For example, Muhammad Taqi Usmani said, if naturalization in the foreign nation is for the purpose of rendering the new nation mighty or to be proud of it or to prefer it to the Muslim identity, the Muslim nation, this is absolutely haram or forbidden. So if you become an American in order to make America great, that is an unforgivable sin. Now, Sheikh As-Salami, the Mufti of Tunisia, he said all the essentials of naturalisation that we've laid out, and he explains what's expected of a loyal citizen, constitute an absolute rejection of the rules of Islam, and they reflect a categorical intention to deny Islam. This amounts to preferring the sovereignty of others over Allah's rule. So he's saying that when you become a citizen, you tend to have to abide by the laws of the land, to submit to them and honour them, but this amounts to a rejection of Islam's laws. So a Muslim has rejected Islam. They've become an apostate, he said, if they did that. So there's quite strong positions that run through all of these fatwas, even though they all say, yes, it is possible under certain circumstances to become a citizen, but not if you're going to identify with your nation and serve it and honour it and regard it as a goal to make it a great nation. Now, these rulings were gathered together in 1985. And they were produced by very supreme authorities in the Islamic world. So they're quite well known. These are not new ideas that I'm presenting to you. And Muslims in the West have had 25 years in the meantime to think about this. And they're still working on it. It's not a closed question. But you can imagine, given what I've described, that loyal, pious Muslims would find themselves in a theological pickle in the West over these issues if they were to take these principles seriously. One strategy to solve the problem is the one that Al-Alwani came to himself. He declared some years ago that America was Dar al-Islam. It's an Islamic state. And the advantage of that you don't have to migrate because you're already living in an Islamic state. This is the British solution in India. And he said that's because if you're a radical Muslim in America or a conservative Muslim, you're more able to follow your religion than you would be in, say, Egypt. So that's one solution. It brings its problems as well. And some have emphasised, in recent years there's been some theological innovation, and some theologians have sought to emphasise the brotherhood of humanity, the equality amongst human beings apart from religious identity, and have looked to verses in the Quran that emphasise creation and the common status of being a human being. So that's a new, innovative direction which has certainly not won the day in Islamic law. There's finally one more issue that I want to touch on briefly, and that is the concept of taqiyya or deception. There are a number of circumstances in Islamic law where it's permitted to deceive. Defending yourself in a court case or when you're trying to reconcile people and marital relations. But there's a specific verse, Surah 3, chapter 3, verse 28 in the Quran that says that you're not supposed to take non-believers as your protectors, except by way of precaution that you can guard yourselves from them. And all the commentators agree that what this means is that when Muslims are in a minority or vulnerable position, they're allowed to take non-Muslims as friends or protectors, but not with sincerity. And the commentaries are really quite shocking for us as Westerners to read. As-Zamakhshari, he said, it's permitted to take non-Muslims as guardians or friends if you fear them, but this is the contrary of the real relationship. He said the heart is comforted by enmity and hatefulness. This is really quite disturbing. And Ibn Kathir said, he quoted from a tradition and said, we smile in the face of some people although our hearts curse them. And he said this deception is allowed until the day of resurrection. Maududi made similar comments. So I talk about that more in my book, The Third Choice. So that's another theological complexity of how do you juggle classical demands of Islam with living in the West. Now, these raise very difficult issues. Muslim theologians have a lot of work to do. It's new work. It's not something after 1400 years that Muslims have really spent a lot of time working on. How do you live as a non-Muslim, as a Muslim in a non-Islamic environment? Also, you could notice another thing about this, that if there's pressure, if you're a Muslim living in America and there's a theological pressure that your presence there is justified religiously if you meet certain concessions, there's some pressure to make sure you meet those concessions. So if your presence there is justified by da'wah, by proclamation, then you surely better get involved in da'wah and sharing your faith, because that would justify your presence in the country. Or if your presence is justified because you'd be persecuted back home, you better have complete freedom to get everything you need for Sharia law in America, because if you're persecuted here, there's no justification for being here at all. You may as well be back in the Islamic country. So this raises complex issues for Muslims. These are important issues for public policy. If leaders are unfamiliar with these aspects of Islamic law, and in fact the way they've been discussed by Muslims over the last 25 to 30 years, they will come up with very bad policy decisions. You don't want to validate the overall worldview. We want to encourage Muslims to settle down and become full participants, but without legitimising this particular theological worldview I've described. And handing over concessions, as Lord Phillips, the Chief Justice in Britain, did when he said that Britain should embrace Sharia law, is also not a good idea. We don't really want to become second-class dhimmis, non-Muslims, living in an increasingly Shariaized society. That can't be the solution of these problems as well. One of the difficulties with the kinds of issues I've raised is that we're frightened, of course, of becoming xenophobes, of falling into hatred and animosity and hostility. But that shouldn't prevent us from dealing with the reality of the theological challenges that Muslims are facing. Another thing also has to be emphasised is the diversity of beliefs and practices among Muslims. They have different views on these issues. So al-Awali's solution of declaring America an Islamic state is a reflection of that. We live in a very theologically dynamic period, I think, for Muslims, at least in the West. And we can be sure that the Muslims are working hard on this issue. It's a fundamental issue for them. And they're coming up with lots of different solutions. There will always be some Muslims that will reject innovative theology, who will go back to more conservative views. So no one view is going to sweep the floor, but the issue will continue to be a pressing one for Muslims living in the West. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. I'm Daniel Pipes, President of the Forum. Thank you for that very careful discussion of a delicate issue and a very well-informed one as well. Fascinating. I'd like to start by asking you a couple of questions. First, first, could you comment on the ideas of Tariq Ramadan, that there's a third category? It's not just Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb, the classical house of Islam, house of war, but there's also a Dar al-Solha, a house of quite sure how to translate it, of truce, yeah. Which is neither this nor that, but offers basically the benefits of living here without tension. And secondly, could you draw, you mentioned that there are public policy implications, could you draw some public policy implications? What do you think this means in its unsettled state? What does this mean for politics? What should we be advocating?
It's one of the solutions to the twofold division is to multiply categories. So it gives a permission for Muslims to be in an in-between zone of a state that's not hostile to them, where they can be free and they don't have to go to war. So that's one pragmatic solution. I don't think that addresses the fundamental drivers of that distinction. So the hadiths and the verses in the Quran that say that you should live under Islamic rule still are in existence. So you'd need to do quite a lot of deeper theological work to justify those particular categories. It's not enough just to create a new category. You have to think through what the implications of that. There's also another issue, is that if nations in the West begin to say no to the Sharia demands, so if governments become firmer in saying we'll let you have this much Sharia but not that much, and we're going to draw a line in the sand, you run the risk of triggering the Muslims into the situation where they feel persecuted, and that will create other problems for them as well. So in a sense, one of the challenges of Tariq Ramadan's proposal is it's an invitation to the West to, and the same with Al-Awani saying American Islamic State, to give the Muslims what they need in order to practice their Sharia freely, and then we'll all be at peace. But that's not necessarily the best answer. I think for governments in the West, you really need to be confident about programs that encourage citizens to be proud of your country. It sounds pretty kind of mundane, but there were some horrendous anarchist attacks in the late 19th century in the US, and one of the outcomes of that is people in schools began to be trained to sing the national anthem and salute the flag, and that's there were good reasons why that became a widespread American practice. And you need some way of encouraging young Muslims to be proud of the country. I think we need to develop the art of saying no to requests to Sharia, but also at the same time to be welcoming and gracious towards Muslims. Muslims are in a very kind of fraught predicament, really, if they're caught between the classical views and modern conditions. I think you need to understand these dynamics very, very thoroughly. I don't think there's simple answers, but we need to develop the art of saying no graciously. And I think one issue for us is freedom of religion is almost like an unchallengeable value in our thinking. So if someone says it's my religious freedom, we have to say yes to them. But actually we're going to have to say no to Sharia law in lots of different areas. Not all religious rights can be permitted to be practiced. I mean, you're not going to allow fathers to circumcise their daughters if their religion tells them to do it. So we need to develop a bit of fortitude about saying no over certain religious practices and rights. And I don't think we've got anywhere near that place. And I think longer term, gradually to accustom people to say, well, we're never going to budge on that, you know. We're not going to allow polygamy as an official practice, for example, or whatever it is. I'm sorry, you know, but it's just not going to happen in this country. The sooner you say that clearly, the more people will accustom themselves. But keeping the Muslim community in a kind of dangling situation where they have hope that if they press hard enough, they'll get the whole shebang and be able to create a Sharia-compliant enclave in the new country, that's really cruel. Because they can only succeed in the end by causing huge conflict with the other citizens in the country. It's not fair to them to do that. So there's some thoughts.
You mentioned Sharia-compliant enclave, which is a different approach entirely. What could you talk more about that? I mean, what we've seen in a number of countries, including right here on South Broad Street, is the potential development of an enclave where only Muslims live, where the Sharia is practiced.
Yes, there was a case a year or two back where a British government minister went into a mainly Islamic area and he was told, "Why have you come onto our territory?" Said Qutb, as part of his strategy for establishing Islam, said that Muslims should establish territorial regions where Islam was dominant. It derives from the narrative of Muhammad's life. Go to Medina and establish Islam there. So there's some ideological pressure amongst radical Muslims to establish areas so you have an Islamic local council and try and have as much Sharia compliance in a local region as you can. And that's really not very helpful. It's not a helpful solution to this problem. And some parts of the world have suffered. The UK has huge issues with some areas that are sort of no-go zones. For you can't wear a yarmulke in some parts of Melbourne. You know, that's not a good solution, and that's something to be wary of.
The French government has published a list a few years ago of what it called 751 zones urbaines sensibles, delicate urban areas, where the normal functions of state don't apply. Not the right way to go. Let's open it up and.
Reverend, we have been apprised that militant Muslims practicing Islam are charged with the responsibility of, in essence, dominating the world, and that part of their mission is to basically take the role of a conquest over the Western countries. We have seen in this country an apologist approach by American Muslims who say that that's not a demand of Islam. Can you comment on that, please?
The Quran says that Islam will dominate over other faiths. Muhammad said he's been sent with a mission to dominate other faiths. So it's that view is well supportable from classical Islamic sources. It has a lot of oomph behind it. And I think you'd probably find all those muftis in major nations, most of them would have that view if you ask this question of them straight. Islam rules, it's never ruled. But of course most Muslims, or many Muslims in the West, don't live thinking that way. Some would, say have that hope in the longer term. you'll see little pictures of the White House with the black flag of Islam flying on it, and with protesters would carry around. So it's a strong narrative that Islam should dominate, but the challenge for Muslims living in the West is to rethink their theology. Snoek Groningen, who was writing 100 years ago about the Islamic situation in Holland, his hope was that Muslims would move those sorts of expectations to the last things. You know, they'd be looking forward to something at the end of time where they'd rule the world, but not now. That was his solution. I think it is actually a core hope of mainstream Islamic thought that Islam should dominate. But what you're finding is that Muslims in the West are finding other ways through. They're thinking there's emphasising other aspects than political dominance. So one of the interesting questions will be what will happen in the Middle East as more Islamic regimes come in online. For example, you have to think that the Islamic Fiqh Academy is made up of muftis and others, leading authorities from different countries, who were appointed by people from the more moderate end. So the president of Egypt appoints a scholar to be the Grand Mufti of the nation. He's not going to appoint a Salafi. But as each of those countries become more Islamicized and the governments become more radical, then they will appoint leaders who are more radical, and they will be meeting together in the Fiqh Academy, and they will be more radical. So you're going to see a kind of a more conservative bent in the top levels of the Islamic legal community, and so the problem's not going to go away.
We talked about the word religious innovation, and I remember that Henry VIII had a fight between Bloody Mary, the Catholics, and the Protestants. How would legitimately there be religious innovation in Islam, and how does that relate to religious innovation in Judeo-Christian tradition?
That's the second one. It's a very big question. There's a couple of different views in Islam. One is that you can't innovate, that the best thing is to go back to the practice of Muhammad and the early Muslims, restore what was lost. So that's the idea, medieval idea of reform, is to go back to the source. Another view is that Islam is flexible and pragmatic and adaptable, and so you can develop new perspectives as times change. And clearly, for millions of Muslims to live under non-Muslim rule requires a different theology. So there's a sort of pragmatic reason why you'd want to rethink things. But as long as you go back to the source, I think it's quite hard to rethink your theology. If your touchstone of orthodoxy is what would Muhammad say and do, then it's actually quite hard to move forward. But Muslims are divided on those issues today.
Would you say overall that it's more difficult in the abstract for Muslims to make changes for modern life than it is for other monotheists?
I believe it is. It's much harder. And it has to do with some key theological settings that Muhammad put in place. For example, the requirement that Islam and politics not be distinguished. That's really hardwired into Muhammad's life. It's very difficult to undo that. Much easier to build a distinction between secular and ecclesiastical domains based on the New Testament or on the Old Testament than it is to do it based on the life of Muhammad. It's a deeply... The other problem is the example of Muhammad himself, his wars, his response to opposition. I sometimes think of it as a bit like playing a game of cards. You can imagine there's two Muslims playing cards, and one's a more moderate and one's more radical. But the problem is the radical has got all the aces and the kings. The words of Muhammad are really quite compelling on a lot of the key issues. So I'm speaking as a theologian, as someone who thinks theologically and believes in the power of faith to motivate people. I understand what it means to live for the next world and not this world. That's part of my own wiring. And I think the foundations of Islam make it quite hard. There is lots of evidence that Muslims can adapt themselves, but usually they adapt themselves to the modern world by becoming a bit less religious. There is no global movement that I'm aware of that's a kind of progressive theological movement in Islam that has a significant, powerful presence. That all the key kind of global networks and organisations like the Islamic Fiqh Academy and others, the Muslim Brotherhood's one, have a more conservative, going back to the source orientation. So I'm a bit pessimistic about the prospects of reforming Islam. I think you can reform Muslims, as Muslims can become less religious and adapt beliefs that perhaps sometimes are more in conflict with the things that Muhammad did and said. But unfortunately, the emphasis has been going the other way. We're kind of getting towards the peak of a century-long revival of conservative Islamic thought. And while there have been lots of reformers of a more moderate variety, they just haven't managed to get lots and lots of disciples, and they haven't had the guns behind them or the money to maintain momentum.
Just to argue with you for a second, if we were a century ago in 1912, the guns and the ideas were with the modernizers. If it changed then, why can't it change again?
The guns and the ideas were with the colonial powers, and the modernizers were in step with them. At that time, Snooker Gronje thought, the great Dutch Arabist, he thought it was absolutely inevitable that Muslims would have to accustom themselves to the modern world. But the inspiring preachers of the radical revival, like Maududi and Said Qutb, have been more effective in winning young people to their cause. And the reformist thinkers have been hanged and driven out and silenced, and so it's possible that there could be a backlash. Iranians today dislike Islam more than they did 30 years ago, in general, and that's why tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands perhaps are becoming Christians in Iran. There's a dislike of the revolution. So there's a possibility of a kind of swing back. If people will vote for Sharia, it's a religious duty to do so. To actually experience full conservative Islam could be very painful and disturbing. So you can see a kind of a swing back. So I think the Islamic revivalist movement, the Islamic movement as it's often called, has not lost momentum yet, but it may well come in the next decades that it begins to peter out and lose credibility.
Thanks.
You're both experts. The question I have is, both of you know what systemic Islamic dogma and doctrine teach. So how is it possible to have not to have a clash of civilizations with Islamic culture, Judeo-Christian culture, which seem to be the antithesis of each other? Both talk about that?
Yeah, I think the theological visions are very different.
I mean cultural.
But they shape the cultures. For example, the distinction between church and state, I think, derives out of a theological perspective at its root. I think there is a huge challenge of a tension between cultures. I think at the same time, I'm talking about really deep theological drivers that shape societies over centuries and decades, and it's a generational project really forming people in a theological vision. In practice, people are much more pragmatic. They accustom themselves to circumstances. They want their children to grow up. They want to live in peace. And so people will often compromise with their theologies. And that gives you more hope, that they'll just get sick of all the nonsense and be willing to make choices that bring more peace in the world. That might seem fairly simplistic, but in many cases that's the case. I think people will get sick of the Turkish regime when the Turkish economy collapses. They will not be so enthusiastic about an Islamist government there. So there's other considerations other than theology that shape people's behaviour.
And by the way, according to an article in Middle East Quarterly currently, the collapse in Turkey is imminent. I would say, just briefly, that no, there's not a clash of civilizations. There's a clash between civilization and barbarism. And barbarism has different manifestations. One is fascist, one is communist, and there's Islamist. We defeated two, now we have to fight the third. But there are Muslims on our side in that fight.
A two-part question. First part, is there any group within Islam similar to the Druze, where they practice their religion but are loyal to the state? I guess the Druze are an offshoot of Islam. And the second question is, if you are a religious Muslim, on the model of Nidal Hassan, should I trust you in my military?
I think the Ahmadis are a heterodox group who are much better citizens in general. They've reversed abrogation. They prefer the earlier verses in the Quran, the more peaceful ones. I think military should be very cautious about putting Muslims in key positions in the armed forces. It's difficult because our whole society is set up on the basis of non-discrimination. But history is full of examples of Muslims that have not been reliable allies when it comes to jihad. In his case, he explained very clearly that this would happen if he was posted to that place. And so that was just sheer folly to put him in that situation. But no, you should be careful. I mean, I don't think it would be wise, for example, to have only Muslims doing all your sensitive translation for you of Arabic sources in the Middle East. There's loyalty issues, but we are so, I mean, it's very hard for the US to deal with this. I mean, there's such a sense of guilt about what was done with the Japanese in the Second World War. Kids are taught in school about these things. And many minorities have known what it is to be discriminated and against and to be stigmatised. So we're very fearful of losing our identity by making such hard decisions. But I think it's quite rational to look at the evidence. I mean, look at all the cases where American members of the American military have run amok and killed other fellow Americans, and I think you'll find just about every case there's been a religious motivation. It's a rational consideration to pay attention to.
Indeed, I keep a blog called something like Islamist Penetration in Western Security Forces, which gives example after example in the military, in the police, in environmental agencies, in airport security, and in customs, and on and on and on. Where time and again, there's a Muslim individual who, for reasons of jihad, does in fact betray the trust in him. It is an abiding problem, Bill.
You make the point that in Sharia there's no distinction between the political and the religious.
That's right.
And given the Arab Spring and given the fact that they're a minority in the world and they have to deal with more nations that are politically primary than religious, how, by definition, I don't know how they can justify that in any kind of a modern understanding other than that which was current 1,400 years ago.
I think the question is, isn't it very difficult in the modern world when you are a minority and weak to insist on religion and politics being united in that way? It seems kind of irrational and dangerous, really. Exposes yourself to attack. Well, this is the great crisis of the Muslim mind. You know, Bernard Lewis's book, What Went Wrong? Why are we in a weak position when Allah's promised us to be dominant in the world? And that the answer to that crisis is how people answer that crisis determines what kind of Muslim they become. Some of them say, if only we went back to Muhammad and did what he said we should do, then Allah will reward us. If you have a worldview which is ultimately it's God that provides all power and provides the victory, then you're willing to do what might seem to be ridiculous or irrational to others in order to achieve victory. However, if you're more pragmatic, then you'll trust less on Allah and more on, doing what's going to be safer. And Muslims are caught between those different values. But you will see more that the hope of Islamic power rising is going to be a major theme in the Middle East amongst the governments that are now appearing in the Islamist winter that's coming across the Middle East.
Under the freedom of religion here in this country, could a huge Muslim population like exists in Dearborn, Michigan, set up a Sharia court? Sharia
courts already exist in the US, informal ones, as they do all up and down Britain. And they generally get used for very specific issues like getting community approval for your divorce. So they exist. The question is what's happening in them. Is it good for women who are going through those processes? And how intrusive are they in the daily lives of Muslims? I think that's an unclear area yet. We don't really know how well they progress.
Could they settle something like a woman or a man deciding to convert to Christianity?
Every court would rule against that. I mean, it's illegal to leave Islam. They're mainly dealing with women who want to divorce their husbands, but in Islamic law, you can't do that without a court. And so the man can divorce by his own act of saying, I divorce you 3 times. But the women have to get the approval of a court for a divorce. So that's often a very long, drawn-out and difficult situation for women. It's not only Muslims that have issues like this for religious reasons. So they generally don't deal with inheritance issues in the UK because that's dealt with under British law. So there's a limit to how far they intrude. But they're very significant for women who, even though they're divorced according to law of the state, their Muslim community doesn't recognise them as free to remarry. So they're mainly in that area that those courts are active at present. But it is a growing and significant influence in the lives of Muslims in the West, and I think encouraging those courts is complicated, brings complicated problems for human rights.
There are toward 100 informal Sharia courts in Britain, but I don't know that there are any in the United States. You're shaking your head. Anybody know specifically of Sharia courts in the United States?
I read that there are in Michigan. There are Sharia courts, and of course there's conflict. A Sharia court can't rule on something which is illegal under U.S. law.
Well, they do sometimes.
Well,
but I might be corrected, but I actually don't. I personally don't know of any, although they are substantial in Britain. If they do exist here, they're really quite minor and
much less.
Not really a phenomenon. And they do exist in Italy. There was one case where not only were they dealing with civil issues, but with criminal. They chopped the hand off of a criminal in Italy. So there are no limits to where this might go. If I might just make one small point, a Muslim man may convert a woman by saying, I divorce you once. Doesn't have to say 3 times. If he says it 3 times, it means that she has to go and marry someone else.
It's irrevocable, yes.
And then come back to and marry and consummate the marriage with someone else, and then only can she come back to him, but only 1 time. So if he does it 3 times, it's saying, I'm serious about this. I'm not taking you back quickly. David.
I very much admire your careful analysis on this kind of broad subject. How do these Muslim thinkers, religious thinkers, deal with nationality in the Muslim world as a whole? I mean, there's a lot of talk over time about the unity of Islam and Muslims unifying, Arabs unifying, but there seems to be dissension everywhere, and certainly one aspect of that is national identity. How do they deal with this?
I think there's 2 different views that are competing. One is there's only one nationality, the Ummah, the Muslim identity, and that should be realised with the Caliphate or some united Islam. That's a pure theological answer. The other is more pragmatic. I'm the mufti of whatever country, but the president appointed me, and I'm not going to come out with fatwas and rulings that undermine the state because I'll lose my job. So there's some sort of, so you'll find that those muftis will develop reasons why it's legitimate to be a good Egyptian citizen. Yeah, Islam is very pragmatic and flexible. So you've got both of these themes, and one could rise up more in one situation, and some will have this hope of uniting the Muslim world, and others will compromise. So it's really very complicated. It's not simple. I wanted to make one comment about the Sharia courts. Most Muslim countries restrict the application of Sharia law. So in Pakistan, it's illegal for an imam to marry someone unless they register the marriage with the state. They control the activity of religious leaders. In Egypt, they introduced laws to increase the rights of women better than Sharia law in Egypt. So Muslim women are better off than Sharia would allow them to be in Egypt. One of the problems for minorities, if the state doesn't get involved in Sharia, is that a Muslim woman in London could be worse off in a Sharia court in London than she would be in Pakistan or Egypt, because pure Sharia might be applied of some kind or other without the intervention of the state, which often acts to moderate Islamic law. In Egypt, women have more custody of children than Sharia law allows. It's one of the reasons why the Muslim Brotherhood's unhappy with the government, because they want it more strict. So I'm just saying, ironically, Muslims could suffer more from Sharia in some areas in America because of religious freedom than they would in Muslim countries where everyone knows that the 3 times divorce law has to be restricted, so men can't say it in one angry mood, they have to do it over several days and so on. So the state intervenes. Now, should we intervene in the minutiae of how Sharia law is applied and restrict its application? One area we could do is make it illegal for marriage celebrants, registered marriage celebrants, to conduct religious ceremonies that are not registered with the state. That would be a really good thing to do in America and Australia. So you can't have polygamous marriages being set up by religious leaders who are also licensed to do state-sanctioned marriages. That would be an example of a good thing that would restrict the kind of growth of Sharia.
Could you spell that out? How would that make a difference? Because polygamy is illegal in this country, so how would it change anything?
Many Muslims, you'll find, are polygamously married, but only one of them would be registered with the state. But what the state should do is what they do in Pakistan, and make it illegal for the imam to marry someone without registering it with the state. So you've got someone the state has registered to do marriages. They do some and register them, and they do others and don't register them. And so the community develops with the practice of polygamy monitored by the mosque, but only some are registered with the state. It creates a lot of problems legally and socially. And the British are moving towards actually recognising these for social security purposes. It would be better to make it illegal. You say if you marry people without registering the marriage with the state, you can't have your tax deductibility, you're no longer a celebrant, you actually intervene. And you could do it in a way that doesn't focus on Islam particularly. I mean, I'm an Anglican minister. I shouldn't be conducting weddings for people without registering them in the church, you know. It doesn't have to have Islam written all over it.
The Sharia laws, aren't they similar to the Judaic rabbinical courts? I mean, if you're an Orthodox Jew, you can't just go to the state and say, I want a divorce. You have to have a Jewish divorce. So the point is that there are other accommodations between state and religious jurisdiction. And maybe this is something that could be used as a precedent for observing some of the Sharia laws and yet not negating the political laws.
I think the question is, isn't Sharia law similar to, say, Jewish law? There already, sometimes people need to have their issues dealt with in a religious Jewish court. Why wouldn't Muslims need to do the same? I mean, I'm not an expert in Jewish law. My impression is that Islam's much tougher, much harder. The human rights of women in a Sharia court are really trampled on in a terrible way. And the need to intervene in Sharia practice is greater. Let me give you one example. In Shafi'i Islam, circumcision of girls is obligatory as part of Islamic practice. And I think the state would want to make that illegal. In other schools of Sunni Islam, it's recommended or permissible. So there's some aspects of Sharia that need to be monitored. I've heard accounts of the courts, Sharia courts in the UK, and it's heartrending, really. Maybe the Jewish courts are heartrending, I don't know, but it's really disturbing what's going on in those courts. So I think you need to pay more attention, really. The assumption that, they're just like us, or Sharia law with the place of women in Islam is quite similar to the place of women in Judaism, I think that's a mistaken assumption.
I mean, there is another aspect beyond the human rights element that the Reverend noticed, and this is another aspect that he noticed, that Judaism, Christianity, they accept the supremacy of the state. So if you have a halachic court, a Jewish court, they don't have any intention, they accept, for example, in the first place, that the state authority overrides them. Then they don't have the intention of imposing it on the majority society in which they live. So the Jews of Brooklyn, or I don't know, Mea Shearim, don't want, Mea Shearim may be different, but Brooklyn don't want to impose it on American society, whereas Sharia law is the first step to imposition of the system on American society. So they say that at the beginning, let us practice our own law in our enclaves, But what they are basically aiming at is converting American society, and here is the danger.
That's true.
That's true.
We're almost out of time. We really are out of time, but one more, David.
How do American Muslim leaders reconcile, the teachings of integrating church and state with the principles of being an American in the Constitution and separating those things?
They make hay while the sun shines. The system here gives them freedom, so they use that freedom to the maximum. And they accustom themselves to the freedom. If they were in power, their theology would probably shift back to a more conservative view, and they would not perpetuate those freedoms themselves. So it's a very pragmatic response at present. They don't have the power to determine whether church and state are separate in the US. But if they did have that power, they would undo that. You would find laws against proselytizing. You would have restrictions on it. Already there's pressure at present. So you'd find that those freedoms would be undone. I mean, as I think as Daniel Pipes once said, the Christians could have made America a religious state. They could have made America into a state where religion and politics were inseparable, but they chose not to. Islamic societies find that hard to do that. They're not very good at doing it. Lots of Islamic religious parties everywhere. So that's the current situation. They're living between two worlds and taking advantage of the system as it exists here.
But if they're not vocal about there needing to be a reformation, aren't they implicitly supporting something that's antithetical to life in America?
Well, it's very difficult to speak against really clearly established principles that are in the Quran and the teaching of Muhammad. You dance your way around them. You try and find compromises, but it's very hard to contradict the core texts. And that's one of the difficulties about this discussion. Many well-informed Muslims would know that there are these prohibitions on Muslims living in the lands of infidelity. So you have to find a way around it. But you can't just overthrow the core principles. That's very, very difficult. You compromise. And I wish that the US would do more to support moderate Muslims, really. And I was at a briefing, a conference in Washington just recently to launch Silenced, a book by Nina Shea and Paul Marshall. And there were some more moderate Muslims there, and they pointed out that the Obama administration has been consistently privileging more radical Muslims and cutting off more moderates from political access. And that's not creating a climate where the process that you're speaking about can easily happen. In fact, it's having the other effect. The reformers in that sense are really demoralised by the government's policy. So that there could be opportunity for a very welcome shift in a more intelligent policy of managing Islam. This problem will not go away. It's going to be here for centuries. We need a long-term vision for managing it.
Thank you. I want to thank Reverend Mark Durie thank you for showing the book. The book is available outside, The Third Choice. I'd like to thank Reverend Durie for really quite brilliant analysis, very, very careful, very knowledgeable. I think it's suitable for us to be in a law firm where these ultimately very legal issues come up. I mean, you have the Constitution on the one hand, you've got the Quran on the other, and they're not the same. Big differences between them.